All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to our latest Climate Reality Book Club event, a conversation about multi-solving, creating systems change in a fractured world. The Climate Reality Book Club is for both members of the Climate Reality Network and the general public to discuss books with a wide range of themes and genres that are related to climate and the environment. We regularly host webinars with the authors of our selected books, which are moderated by Climate Reality staff and other experts from the field. These webinars provide a unique opportunity to engage in Q&A and commentary and learn more about what you can do to take action on climate. They're open to all, so feel free to invite your friends and family to join them. If you are a Climate Reality leader or chapter member, you can join our book club group on Reality Hub. We use that group to announce each of our book selections and information about upcoming webinars, as well as follow-up educational materials and calls to action from our guests. You can tune into that group to help us determine future book selections, stay up to date with events, and see what folks have been reading. If you do not yet have a Reality Hub account, you can contact support@climatereality.com and we'll assist you. In 2025, we've partnered with our friends at the Canada branch of Climate Reality, who host small group discussions on eco-literature and have most recently been discussing multi-solving. If you or a friend would like to join these discussions, please reach out to Sherry or Ashley, and they're going to put their info in the chat. Today's webinar is being recorded. The recording will be shared in a follow-up email to attendees and in the book club group on Reality Hub. Throughout the webinar, feel free to submit questions for our speakers using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll do our best to get to every question. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jen Hawes from publisher Island Press to introduce our lovely speakers for today.
Thank you, Ella. All right. Hi, folks. As Ella said, I'm Jen Hawes, Partnership Manager at Island Press. And we would like to thank, first off, the Climate Reality Project for continuing to collaborate with us here. We're grateful to be working with you on this event. In case you all are unaware, Island Press is an environmental nonprofit book publisher. Our mission is to elevate voices of change, shine a spotlight on crucial issues, and focus attention on sustainable solutions like we're doing here today. You can learn more at islandpress.org. And I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our panelists this evening, or this afternoon, wherever you are. These two indomitable women are exceptional leaders in the environmental space, and you're going to have a great time listening to them and then jumping in with your own questions. Vernice Miller-Travis is an environmental justice pioneer. She has forged her path through decades of work as a deeply skilled practitioner in cross-cultural engagement and organizational development with significant expertise in clean air, hazardous waste remediation, and clean water public policy and regulatory systems. Vernice is the co-founder of We Act for Environmental Justice and serves on its board. She has been appointed by Governor Wes Moore to the Board of Trustees for the Chesapeake Bay Trust Foundation. She serves on several other national and local environmental nonprofit boards and, in 2024, was awarded the prestigious William K. Riley Lifetime Achievement Award by the American University School of Public Policy. Dr. Elizabeth Sawin is the director of Multisolving Institute, an organization which she founded in 2021 to share research and tools related to the concept that she has helped to develop. Multisolving is both a theory and practice of creating change in complex systems, which address the integrated issues of equity, climate change, health and well-being, and economic vitality. Dr. Sawin has a background in system dynamics computer simulation. Prior to Multisolving Institute, she founded the think tank Climate Interactive to develop tools for grappling with the complexity of the climate system. Dr. Sawin's book, Multisolving, Creating Systems Change in a Fractured World, was published by Island Press in 2021. I will add a link to an excerpt of the book in the chat. And with that, I invite Vernice and Dr. Sawin to start the conversation.
Good evening. Good evening, Beth.
Hi, Vernice. I've been looking forward to this.
Me too. Really, really looking forward to this. So I first want to say, yes, you are my friend. Yes, you are my colleague. But damn, this is a good book, Beth. It's
Oh,
really, really, really good. And it's so timely. It's so timely and so needed.
well, thanks for saying that. It's a long set of hours as a writer, and you're often second guessing, like, am I saying something new that anybody needs to hear? Um, so that's a balm to my soul to know that Vernice Miller-Travis thinks it was helpful.
Well, it's like you were prescient, though. And frankly, Beth, I some days am at a loss to try and figure out where we are as a society, where we're going, and how we got here. And you really sort of give us a path about how we got here, but also how we don't have to stay mired in this moment that we're in.
Yeah, I owe so much in the book to my teachers, and the ones that really influenced the book include Donella Meadows, who was one of the authors of The Limits to Growth in 1972. And Donella and her co-authors, they foresaw the mid-2020s as a really tumultuous time if society didn't listen to really what their analysis was showing. Their analysis showed somewhere in the 1980s, we crossed the sustainable one planet living, and we've been in what systems scientists call overshoot ever since, like living beyond our means. And that can only go on so long. So since Danella was my teacher and friend, um, I've been kind of dreading the 2020s for my whole career because it didn't seem like really the centers of power were taking this information to heart.
I would agree. And one day I want to have a chat with you about Dana Meadows. I went on a wonderful trip with her, the meeting she hosted in Hungary. Um,
I
uh,
didn't know that. I didn't know
yes,
that
and
you had ever met. Wow.
I had met her, and she influenced my thinking as well. So, but I wonder if you would indulge me, and if the audience would indulge me, and let me read the first page and a third of the book. It's the introduction. Is that all right with
That
you?
sounds great.
Okay. And audience, I ask your indulgence, but I just thought it was so potent and powerful and just a great way to start this conversation about this wonderful book, Multisolving. And you say, Beth, convergent crises, cascading solutions, change, emergencies, even crises are normal occurrences in our lives. We build and engage with systems to help us prepare for and cope with disruption. As individuals, we insure our homes and cars, learn first aid, and maybe even volunteer for the local fire department. We practice conflict mediation and pay taxes to help support emergency responsiveness. We save money for a rainy day and donate to the local food pantry to help others who have fallen on hard times. Shouldn't that be enough, you say, Beth? With regard to future crises, shouldn't it be enough to do what previous generations have done? Shouldn't it be enough to take some personal precautions and create institutions to do the rest? Well, if you've reached for this book, then the odds are you suspect that the answer to both questions is no. Are you seeing signs of increasing disruption? Are you witnessing problems cascade, converge, and amplify one another? Are you feeling as though maybe something more is needed in response? Climate change is powering stronger storms and more intense wildfires. Biodiversity is failing, and the frequency of economic disruptions is quickening. In many places, democracy is weakening, and in others, the elite are consolidating wealth. In the face of these mutually reinforcing crises, we need different strategies for coping. The old ones seem to be proving not up to the job. There is no one size fits all experience of destabilization for wealthy North Americans or Europeans. The shocks may feel, and for wealthy North Americans or Europeans, the shocks may feel muffled. For a poor family in the global South, they may be cataclysmic. But if it feels to you that instability is rising and that the periods of calm between storms are shortening, you are not alone. On a planet with growing ecological crises, the trend is toward more destabilization rather than less. When you wrote this, Beth, you wrote this in 2020, and here we are in 2025, and everything that you wrote in this introduction and in this book has really come forward. So you say you weren't always a multi-solver. Can you share a bit about your journey as a scientist who focused mostly on carbon dioxide to this broader perspective you share in this book, Multisolving?
Yeah, I mean, like many multi-solvers I've met, I ended up here by frustration. So I was trained, as you say, as a scientist. At first, I was trained as a molecular biologist, and I made a leap from that to systems science and focusing on climate change. And like so many good people doing important research on climate change, my colleagues and I were really focused on greenhouse gases, CO2 and methane, which makes sense. Obviously, they're a contributor to climate change. If we're going to find the way forward, we have to reduce them. And my colleagues and I, our contribution was to do computer modeling that would help decision makers from nations who are meeting together at the UN understand what they were pledging and what the long-term future would be if all the countries did what they said they were going to do. And so we were sort of holding up a mirror, which is what scientists are supposed to do, right? We're supposed to tell policymakers, is this good enough or not? And for a bunch of years, I was a lead author on a UN report called the Emissions Gap Report. And that's exactly what it did. It said, if every country does what they say, this is the result. And there was a little bit of progress year to year. This would have been in the early 2000s. But every year the message was, you've made some progress and there's further to go. And at this time, I was also a parent. I have two daughters. They were elementary school age. So I'd wave goodbye to them and get on a plane and tell decision makers we've made some progress. There's further to go. I was really frustrated because I felt like we were doing what we were supposed to do, but it wasn't unlocking the results that were needed. Um, Out of that frustration, in the line for coffee at one of these UN meetings, I ended up next to a negotiator. And I introduced myself and I said, what could we add to our analysis as scientists that would unlock stronger proposals? And I thought she'd say, well, you should add famines or floods. I thought she'd tell us like the impact that would unlock change. And instead, she kind of patted me on the shoulder, kind of in a grandmotherly way. And she said, she didn't say child, but that's kind of that's how my grandmother would have said it. She said, the thing we pay attention to as negotiators is how far can we go before our president or prime minister is going to lose the next election? That's what matters. And through her eyes, I could see that this whole race to reduce emissions was all viewed in the lens of sacrifice, right? It was all like, how much sacrifice for the future? And I got really interested in the question of, is it really a sacrifice? Like, what else would change if countries around the world freed themselves from fossil fuels? And of course, now we know that it would be enormous for many things besides climate change. First and foremost, health. Every year, the World Health Organization produces a report, and they say year after year, the costs of getting off of fossil fuels would be more than offset by the health savings. So that's fewer cases of cardiovascular disease and respiratory illness and premature birth. The savings from that alone, and that's before we get to the good jobs or the health that would come if we had walkable cities and people had access to safe exercise. And so I started to learn about all of that, but still was true to I guess my roots as kind of a scientist and a geek. For a long time, I thought that what was needed was to explain this to people. Like, did you know? And I was a little bit of a proselytizer. Did you know about all these other benefits? But I soon had to face the fact that it's not just a problem of knowledge. It's that we've created our systems in such splintered ways that even though there'd be so many benefits of getting free of fossil fuels, it's hard for our systems to find them. And one way I explain this sometimes is imagine you're a country, you want to reduce your greenhouse gases. Well, that's going to be an expense for the energy minister and the transportation ministry. There's going to be a huge savings for the health ministry. But in most countries, those three ministries are in different buildings. People don't know each other. And the energy minister doesn't get any credit for health improvements. So that's an example of not a knowledge problem, but of a relationship problem, which is really what multi-solving is about, is getting over those barriers.
So Beth, let me ask you exactly at that intersection. You talk a lot about complex systems, and I want to know why you start there, but you really just began to talk about those interlocking systems in terms of governance and where the barriers are. You see that from one perspective. How do we make it real to people who are the decision makers that, we can't just keep floating along. We've got to do something dramatic.
Yeah, no, you're right that you have to read a fair number of pages of my book before you really get to multi-solving. And that's how important I think it is to ground these conversations in systems understanding, which I actually think is revolutionary and countercultural in this moment. So actually, big shout out to Island Press. They were the first publisher who agreed that we needed to take time to share systems thinking before we got to multi-solving. Other publishers were like, could you cut that first third? And I kept looking, and that's how important it is to me. Donella Meadows taught, and I don't think anything has proven her wrong. We're in these messes because we treat the world as though it's divisible and the world is whole, right? And that might mean that we somehow think our carbon emissions from the United States are a separate thing from carbon emissions from Mexico, or stronger storms in Indonesia. But it's one Earth system. It's indivisible. And of course, this is so prominent in how we think of our relationship to each other on the planet, right? Whether it's my family can be safe at the expense of some other family, or now in the United States with a resurgence of racial injustice and language oriented around that, that some minority can be safe at the expense of other people. Like systems theory teaches all of that is an illusion. It's not how the world operates. And when you design governance and economics out of an illusion, you're going to have some problems. And we're having problems, So my teachers in systems theory say the main problem is we've designed societies that aren't consistent with the laws of the planet or the truth of our human interconnectedness.
So many questions I want to ask you about this. I met your I met your teacher, Dana Meadows, as part of the NGOs who were forming and coming together for the Earth Summit in 1992. And I think they had not fully been exposed to the environmental justice conversation yet, but everyone who came to the UN for that fourth PrepCom in March of 94 was exposed to it. And we all got to be exposed to each other. And then she invited me to that meeting, and she exposed me to game theory, systems thinking, all kinds of ways that it really hadn't entered my brain yet, but it stuck with me in terms of how we are going to work our way out of this. And your comment just now about sort of where we are, the political and cultural moment that we're in, talks a lot. It speaks a lot to equity and justice, and all the layers of issues under that. But I want to say, Beth, that as long as I've been working on these issues, it was an intellectual effort for me until Hurricane Dorian swept across the small island nation of the Bahamas where most of my family lives. And then it became so real because I couldn't reach them for days and days and days. And then even after I reached them, some family members we didn't hear from for the longest time. Fortunately, no one in our family died, but hundreds of Bahamians did die, and immigrants from Haiti to the Bahamas, who nobody was tracking or knew anything about. So you have a whole chapter in the book on equity. And in fact, you say it's one of the few and only topics that you devote a whole chapter to. Why is that? And why is equity so important for multi-solving? And I mean equity not only in our country, but in a global sense.
Yeah, well, most of what we know about multi-solving, we've learned by looking for the bright spots around the world where people are able to meet multiple goals at the same time, right? So they're able to adapt to climate change and improve biodiversity and produce good livelihoods for people and communities. And so they're the exception, not the rule, but we ask, how do they do it? And one of the things that we see is a refusal to move faster than you can, a refusal to let go of equity in order to move fast or to spend less money, right? It sort of starts to stand out because these days there's a lot of lip service to equity as people become more aware of how it matters. But this is putting it into action. It's to say, we're not going to go forward until all of our partners have been heard, until everybody understands. So, I'm trained in the natural sciences, and then I learned systems theory. I'm a well-educated white middle-class person. And so I had a lot to learn about equity. One thing that systems theory teaches is that we don't all move through systems in the same way. And so what we see is shaped by a lot of our identities. So I'm a student and will be for my whole life of equity. But the data, just like if we want these results, if we want to be able to get the benefit of one solution for multiple goals, that depends on trusting relationships. And you can't have trusting relationships if oppression is in your mix, right? And so no matter how hard it is to do and how under-equipped many of us feel, we're going to be stuck in our silos and not finding these much more actually effective and efficient solutions if we don't get really courageous about including equity in what matters.
So when I first met you, Beth, when I first laid eyes on you, as part of the process for the Kresge Foundation Climate Change Health and Equity Initiative, I walked into the room and you were already having some of this conversation, and I was drawn to you. And I'm like, she thinks the way I'm trying to think and the way we need to be thinking if we're going to unpack this intersection between climate, health, and equity. And you are already fully there. And I felt gratified that the Kresge Foundation asked you to be an advisor to this work where we were working on the communications of it. But your brain works differently, Beth. It just does. And I'm thankful that your brain works differently because you're thinking on multiple levels. So you've said that um, that the multi-slammed, and I'd like you to define what that means for the audience, are some of the finest multi-solvers. What do you mean by that? And what do you think that means for where we should look for leadership in these times? And it's I think you and I've had some conversations about syndemics during the COVID crisis. Is that what you mean by the multi-slammed?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've been talking a lot about the world being divided up into silos and jurisdictions and departments and expertise and why that's a problem. Where that happens less is actually on the ground in communities. I don't know if you would agree, but like you've spent so much of your work in communities. It's obvious how the school is connected to the health, is connected to the water that runs through the community when it's a place. Um, and the places that are least buffered from all of these impacts we're talking about are the marginalized places, right? So in systems theory, what you'd say is actually those are the most sensitive spots in the system. They're the ones that will be the earliest warning. And of course, the environmental justice movement now for decades has been that like sounding the alarm, often not being heard well enough. So because systems are whole, The marginalized communities are the ones that get hit, not just with one impact, but all of them all at once, right? And so, yes, there's climate hazards, but that's put on top of food insecurity, and that's put on top of police brutality, all happening in the same communities. And so the expertise that I'm talking about and the place to look for leadership is the fact that those communities find ways to survive and sometimes even thrive while being hit by multiple impacts. And so the practical skills of multi-solving, that's where they reside in my view. And so I think it's an untapped source of leadership. It's usually under-resourced. And if there is interest, it can be, researchers who want to find those answers, but not necessarily share platforms and resources. And yeah, I wrote in my book and shared some of your thinking early in the pandemic, as you said, about syndemics. I think people would love to hear like what that word means and how it relates.
So I was so racked by how specifically the county that I live in was really devastated by the COVID pandemic. And the reason that I was racked by that is because the county that I live in is the second highest per capita income majority African American county in the United States, Prince George's County, Maryland, just east of Washington, D.C. The highest per capita income county, in case you're curious, is Charles County, Maryland, which is the county just south of us, because the cost of housing has become so high in this county that people are moving to the South County, which is a little bit more rural and a little bit more affordable. But we had the highest incidence of COVID in the state of Maryland, the highest rate of COVID, and the highest rate of death from COVID in the state of Maryland. But we were nowhere near the poorest. We were nowhere near the most isolated. The University of Maryland is headquartered here in this county. The Department of Agriculture is here. The Census Bureau is here. The Goddard Space Flight Center is here. 3 universities are here. And it just made no sense to me, Beth. So I just kept trying to get my hands around what was happening. And I stumbled with the help of a dear friend and colleague, Dr. Adrian Hollis, who was at the Union of Concerned Scientists at the time. We stumbled across this research from the T.S. Chan School of Public Health at Harvard that said, if you live in a place that has an elevated level of exposure to fine particle pollution, PM 2.5, you are more likely to develop COVID, and you were more likely to die from COVID. And the more incremental the percentage of PM 2.5 exposure went up, the higher it went up, the more likely you were, right?
Right.
But it also said, so I looked into research, and there was some research from the AIDS pandemic, where these researchers in New York and other places had found that people who had pre-existing health conditions, who had high rates of poverty, homelessness, were more likely to be infected by AIDS and more likely to die from it. And they created this term syndemic, that when you have multiple threats impacting the same exact population, that creates pandemics on top of pandemics, or it's syndemic, multiple pandemics at once. And it just spoke to me that this is exactly what's happening. And it also spoke to my understanding of environmental justice, exactly as you just described it, Beth, that it's multiple challenges, multiple problems that are happening at the same time that you can't unwind for yourself, because some of them are systemic. And you can't eat enough whole foods, you can't drink enough good water, you can't do enough exercise to get yourself out of that. It is at a systems level. And so, your work around systems thinking also speaks to our work around environmental justice, because it is multiple systems impacting singular populations at the same time. And it's bigger than anything that a particular community can do itself to extract itself from those challenges.
Yeah, that's such a great explanation. And of course, there's even another layer on that, because we know that in most cities, you can take a map of air pollution and a map of former redlining, and and those maps often line up. Same with the maps of where there's green space that will help fight heat waves. So there's also this historical legacy. Like, it's not just happening in this moment. We're dragging the history
Right.
with us until we face it.
Well, um, so what does multi-solving have to offer us in these times of uncertainty and crisis, but also possible opportunity? And one thing I know about you, Beth, is that you are an exquisite scientist. You really are, in terms of giving us an analysis of how did we get here? What are the things? What are the pieces? What were the drivers? But you don't just leave us there. You always give us a way to think about, and what do we do with this? What can we do with this? How can we work our way out of that?
Yeah, well, a few things I've been thinking about a lot lately. One is how many of the examples of multi-solving we've studied actually were a response to crisis. And I'll give a couple examples. One is from Japan, and it's something called green curtains, which is where factories plant these walls of living vines that also produce food. And they shade the factories so they reduce energy, and they produce food for the cafeterias of the factories, and they're beautiful. Um, that was a response actually to the Fukushima disaster, because after that, there was an energy crisis in Japan and they turned off the nuclear power plants till they could assure they were safe. So energy was in very short supply. And so this desire to become more energy efficient produced this beauty, it produced food, it produced an innovation that's now being copied in other parts of the world. Another project that is one of my favorites is in New Zealand. It was a response to a 2008 financial crisis that put the building sector kind of out of work in New Zealand. And so the project the government came up with was to do energy retrofits on housing, which of course is a climate innovation because it reduces energy use. It also saved money for people living on fixed incomes.
And don't they have a lot of geothermal energy in New Zealand?
I think they do. And so this would be a way to like make that count even more. The fascinating thing to me is that someone had the idea to look at the health of the people living in those buildings. And they found that they were spending less on medicine and they were having fewer hospitalizations because the quality of their housing improved. So it was a response to an economic crisis, and it ended up being a health solution. And a second round of that project actually drew in the health ministry. Doctors started being able to refer patients for home energy upgrades, which I thought was super interesting. And so I could go on, but I think as we face this moment of crisis, it's good to remember that crisis generates creativity sometimes. And what people were doing was reaching across silos to embrace each other in the face of crisis. There's so much happening right now that I think is making many of us, and I have my moments, kind of shut down, feel isolated, withdraw, like what can I do? But I think what multi-solving teaches us is, no, this is the most important moment to stay connected or connect even more courageously. So that's one idea about this moment. The other one I write about in the book is what some people call no regrets action. Because another thing about this moment is it's so uncertain, right? We just don't know what's going to happen next. And how do we know what to do? How do we plan? But there are some things that I believe are good to do no matter what's going to happen next. And the way I explain this is if I told you that tomorrow you were going to have to do something really hard, but you don't know whether it's like you're going to have a flat tire on the highway, or you're going to have to work out a difference with a colleague at work, or you're going to have to do a really hard math test, right? Like you don't know what it's going to be. What would you do the night before? I would probably go to bed early, get some good sleep. Next morning, I might eat a good breakfast, right? So that's like attending to your health is a no regrets action. It will help you no matter what comes.
Mhm.
But that's not just an individual strategy. If an ecosystem is healthy, it's better able to recover from fires or to threats to, of an invasive species. If a neighborhood is healthy, and we see this, right? It's better able to protect people if there's predatory action coming at a population, say immigrants or something, right? So a healthy and connected neighborhood is more resilient and better able to respond. So what health looks like is different in every situation, but it's almost always, in my view, a no regrets investment. And I think sometimes when we feel this urgency, people are actually sacrificing their health. And I think that's the exact wrong thing, even though it feels so dire. Um,
And to that end, Beth, I've seen lots of reports, and I can see it in my own family, that young people are particularly distraught in this moment. Um, they see all around them challenges and challenges that they don't exactly know how to navigate, and still coming out of the COVID experience. Um, what do we say to them? What do we model for them? What do we what do we do to give them a sense that we can come through this and we can be better on the other side?
I honestly think we give them resources and we listen to them. Um, I actually think part of what we're experiencing this in the United States, this boomerang, is I think we had the most systems thinking, systems acting generation in the United States, these young people. If you think about their tolerance for difference, their acceptance of the sort of fluidity of being human, in all sorts of different ways. I, I think powerful people in powerful places are actually very threatened by what I would call a systems orientation that I think young people have been embodying. And I think we're watching a reaction to that. So I guess I feel like protect those young people, validate them, resource them. Um,
Indeed. Indeed, indeed. And what is it that you do, Dr. Beth? I can give you a simple answer for what I do. It's called Talenti Southern Butter Pecan Gelato. And I don't overdo it, but when the day has been particularly tough, I have to have a few ounces of that.
Yeah, I'm really fortunate. I have a lot of ways to stay balanced. I live in a community with lots of young families. So yesterday I did an art project with a bunch of kids age 6 to 10 or so. And I had such a lift out of that and just watching them and helping them. And I spend a lot of time in nature. I'm a big gardener and a big woods wanderer. Whenever I can. And that's really, in addition to systems and Denella Meadows, nature is another one of my teachers.
And I also like the company of friends and family and colleagues. I think I almost lost my mind during COVID, not being able to see my people. And my dear friend, Dr. Adrian Hollis, who I mentioned to you earlier, Adrian used to live about 15 minutes from me. And when she would talk to me on the phone, which was daily, and she thought I was getting a little too stressed, she would come over to my house. She would stand at the end of my very long driveway, and she would make me stand at the top of the driveway where the garage is, and we would chat. And we would chat until we got tired of standing up, and then she would go back home. And she would do that, 2 or 3 times a week, just to say, I need to make sure Vernice does. Now, she's an extreme extrovert, an introvert, and I'm an extreme extrovert. So she's like, she's not going to make it if she doesn't have somebody to talk to in the flesh. So, but love of the people around us, and loving them in the ways that we can, and sometimes just the socialization of being with good people. Sometimes people and sometimes people you don't, but I think that's really important in moments like this.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with that more. I don't know if you know, Vernice, but the day after my book was published, I broke my ankle in 3 places.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. So I had to have surgery. I couldn't put any weight on my ankle for over 3 months. And so luckily I have a partner who took really good care of me, but more so embedded in a community of people who did our shopping and brought us food and uh, cut my hair, you know, because it was too long and I couldn't take showers, like all those things.
And Beth, didn't you also move during this period of time?
Yeah, I moved, and also my dad had a really serious illness for most of the winter. He's doing a lot better. Yeah, so we have these moments in our lives, but I'm determined to be a better soup maker for other people. Like I realized how much that mattered. Um, that
Yes,
we
yes,
take
yes,
that
yes.
from these hard times.
Well, Beth, is there anything else you want to share with folk about the book before we go to Q&A?
Yeah, I'll share just a dream I have about the book, actually. One thing I did was I wrote questions at the end of each chapter. And when I wrote them, I was picturing people in communities, maybe organizations or movements or a place, reading the book together and getting to know and trust each other more by virtue of the book passing through their hands and through their conversations. So it makes me especially happy that the climate reality folk read the book together. We know of other groups around the world. So nothing would make me happier than we say multi-solving rewires communities, right? It makes new connections. And those connections are such a source of innovation and resilience. So if the book helps make some new connections, all of it will have been worth it.
Thank you for that, Beth. Thank you. We so need your thinking. We need this book. Um, we need to depend on each other, but we also need to work together. Something that we don't always do. One thing I notice about where I live, I moved here to Prince George's County, Bowie, Maryland, from New York City. Born and bred, New York City, from Manhattan. Undergrad, grad school, the whole nine, until I moved here when I was almost 40. And I moved here primarily because my then husband to be was moving here. But I took one look at the front yard, Beth, and it's just grass, grass as far as the eye can see, and then woods. And I hadn't even come in the house, and I said, "Okay, I want to buy this house." And my then not husband yet said, "Well, don't you want to go inside?" And I said, "Well, you've been inside, right?" And he said, "Yeah." And he said, "But most people go inside the house first before they make the decision." He said, "How could you make a decision standing out here in the driveway?" I said, "Well, you see that front yard? That's more grass than I ever had access to growing up. And then there's another yard on the side, and then there's one in the back that's even bigger." And that open space changed me. It changed the kind of thinker I was. It changed the kind of writer I was. It changed the kind of person I was. I wasn't as stressed out or as anxious. Or I think EPA Region 2 would say, or as mean, because I used to get in a lot of fights with them about environmental stuff in New York City. Um, but it makes a difference, what you have access to, right? And what you do with that, but also how you make that available for others. I think that's a really important thing about where we are in this moment. And Beth, I'm so grateful to you for having written this book in this moment. You've been gestating this book for a while, but you came out with it. As they say, there's a saying in the Black church: he may not come when you want him, but he's right on time. And that's
Yeah.
how you are with this book, Beth. So I'm going to turn it over to the folks curating the Q&A in the chat. Ella?
Yes, thank you both so much for what's been such a rich discussion already. And yeah, we have a few questions that have been coming up during the small group discussions about this book that I wanted to share. So the first one is folks have been really curious about the implementation side of things. So they were wondering, how do you build community around the solutions and really move from talking to doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, for the book and also for teaching that we do at Multisolving Institute, we tried so hard to come up with a diagram of the multi-solving process. And first we thought it was a straight line, like identify problem, bring people together. And we're like, we talked to people actually doing this, and we're like, it is definitely not a straight line. So we're like, okay, it's probably a circle. You know, like you in iterative cycles, like, well, first you identify a problem and then you do something and then you build community and then you see a new problem. And they're like, well, maybe, but that's pretty simple. So we're like, okay, it's a spiral. So it's all these, you know, it's like going around a circle, but each circle is bigger, because that's one thing we saw, like when I mentioned the New Zealand example, how it started focused on energy efficiency, and then they pulled in health and medical and public health. But finally we're like, no, it's nothing like that. It's actually like a plant is what we decided. And it has these parts that are below the ground, where the trust building and the shared understanding and the relationship creation is happening. And that's happening all the time. It's not like that's a step and then you go do action, but it's the least visible and the hardest to resource, because in our culture, people don't count that very much. And just like, well, you're just talking, you're just listening, you're just holding space. But from that root system emerges a plant, and the plant has kind of the projects, you know, like, okay, we're going to build a bike path, or we're going to insulate a bunch of homes. But then it has the results, which we think of as the blossoms of the plant. And so that's fewer kids with asthma. That's more youth with access to good job training. And those two things, the plants and the flowers, are what most people see. And then there's a fourth thing, which is the seeds that float away from all of that. And it's probably the most important thing to my mind. It's how those changed relationships change people who might go to other places, but they're not the same people anymore. So I get asked a lot of times, like, can I do a training on multi-solving? And so far I have kind of said no to that, because we don't see any like one size fits all way of doing it. We think about the plant. We also think about 4 attributes, 4 focuses. And I'll just say those because I think if you're aiming toward those, you'll find your way. So it's centering equity, crossing silos, multi-directional flows, by which we mean money, ideas, resources, relationships. There's not like one person who's the source of all of that. It actually, the hat keeps changing. Sometimes it's the mayor, sometimes it's the grandmother from the neighborhood. And the fourth one is solidarity, which to us means it's not just a partnership to get a policy across the finish line. It's actually, I care about what keeps you up at night as much as I care about what I'm most worried about. So those are some guiding attributes, I guess, to look for. Vernice, yeah, go ahead.
Can you repeat those 4 again? Centering equity.
Centering equity, crossing silos.
Crossing silos.
So that might mean health and climate, but it might also mean like city and state, all kinds of silos. Multidimensional flows. Sharing money is one of the most obvious, you know, and it goes in all directions, but also sharing expertise and valuing lived experience as much as formal credentials. And then solidarity, which is the example I often give of this is back in my climate days, the words we used were co-benefits, right? So we're going to address climate change, and then there'll be this nice co-benefit of fewer kids with asthma. But you start to meet parents of kids with asthma who've been to the emergency room twice this month. They're probably not going to say that's a co-benefit, right? That's a main benefit. And so solidarity says we embrace them all. They're all important, and there's no hierarchy. It's not that climate is the big one and there's another nice to have. And the climate movement would be totally different in my mind if everyone in the climate movement was passionate about kids with asthma. Like that's part of what we're here for too. I think we'd have a lot more to show for the climate movement if we were oriented that way.
Love that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to hone in as well on centering equity. So there was another question from the group about, can you speak more to what elements of this book are most important for those folks who are working towards equity or working with equity-seeking groups?
Yeah, we should ask Vernice to answer that too, maybe. But The thing that comes to mind for me, I learned from my friend Nathaniel Smith, who's the founder of Partnership for Southern Equity based in Atlanta. And we, a few years ago, collaborated on a project called the Just Growth Circle, which PSE still stewards to this day. But Nathaniel's a proponent of values-based organizing. And so the first thing we did was hold all these people from different parts of the city. There was like climate advocates, water advocates, jobs advocates, health advocates. And we convened them over and over and over again until they could agree on a consensus value statement. And it was 4 things. It was things like people who live in communities should have the final say on the infrastructure that affects them. And later, people would look at these 4 principles and they'd say, you got those people to agree to that, because it would included city officials, people who were typically fighting with each other. But that's part of Nathaniel and his team's patience and skill, was convening those people based on their values as human beings instead of their values within the organizations that they had to represent. And even though so much change, we went change in administration, both at the mayor level, and the first Trump term happened in all of that. But the groups were able to continue this just commitment to equity and justice because it was personal to them. And they had taken the time to really identify that. So I think a lot of time in this work, you meet people who can't actually express their values as human beings because of the silos that they're within. And that sounds abstract, but an example of that is a guy I met who was working on urban conservation, and he was really great at getting funding for parks. But what kept happening was every time he built a park, it would set off a wave of gentrification. And the neighborhood he was hoping that his efforts would benefit, those people couldn't afford to stay there. And he's like, I don't know, we need affordable housing, but I'm not an expert in that. I know about conservation and fundraising. But he built partnerships, he and his colleagues, that included affordable housing advocates. And they started doing things like making affordable housing plans before the news even got out that the park was planned. So he couldn't do it himself. That's what I mean about sometimes we can't live our values by ourselves. We actually need partners in order to do that. And why I said at the beginning that frustration is one of the main drivers of multi-solving. Like, people can't get the results they want alone, and that brings a lot of us together. Vernice, would you say anything about that, given a life of leadership around equity?
I would say that is exactly right. And I too love Nathaniel's work in the Partnership for Southern Equity. When we value information, ways of being, ways of doing that come from other places other than what we are used to, is usually when we experience growth. And when we get to some deep problem solving is when we bring other information in that is oftentimes outside the realm of our expertise. One example for me is that before I started working at Metropolitan Group, where I work now, leading our environmental, climate, and energy justice work, I worked for a different firm, and I was in the um, planning and community development part of the company. I'm an urban planner, and but I'd never really worked with landscape architects. And I realized that landscape architects, many of who I worked with at the firm became some of my closest colleagues, really had the answers to some of the problems that I had been trying to work my way through, particularly around green infrastructure. And had I not been exposed to them and their way of thinking and their way of doing, I would not have come to some really amazing insights, but also delivering some amazing outcomes with communities around the country. But it was really outside my area of expertise. I don't think even though I was a planner, I don't think I even really thought about landscape architects and the impact that they could have on a physical environment, and then on community. So being open to what other people have to teach me, being open to other areas of expertise. I couldn't agree with that more. Lots of times when I've worked, and I'm a New Yorker, as I said, but I've really met some wonderful people in urban and mostly in rural settings about different ways of thinking, different ways of being, and different ways of problem solving, right? And when you match that up with what people are doing in other places, then you get sort of exponential growth around thinking and doing, right? And so I just feel blessed to have been in a lot of spaces, to have learned from a lot of different people, Beth, and that is really important, that you not be closed. And so I try to teach that to other people, but I especially try to teach it to government folk, and government agencies, about how even in their own circles, talk to the people in other departments, right? Uh, Talk to the people in other agencies, because none of us has the singular answer. And as long as we stay in that box, we are never going to work our way out of the problem. So I so resonate. That's why I said, Beth, at the beginning, I needed this book, and I needed this book right now at this moment. We all do.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Thank you both. I think we have just like 3 minutes left, but we can maybe squeeze in a wrap-up question, which is, could you speak a little bit more to your hopes for what folks will take away from this book and your vision of the person who you think would find this information most useful?
A lot of the times lately, I find myself talking about multi-solving as a hidden movement. It's so common for me to have someone come up to me and say, I didn't know there was a word for the way that I think. And we really never take credit for like developing even these ideas. Multi-solving belongs to all of us. But what I'm hoping we're doing is holding up a mirror where people realize that actually they're part of something people all over the world are doing, and something that's so needed right now. And that we can learn from each other. So a lot of what we do is share the success stories of multi-solving, because we don't have time for each of us to reinvent the wheel. So I guess my biggest hope for the book is a lot of people will see themselves in those pages and realize they're on their way of their journey. And yeah, we can all always improve, but they're already doing it.
Well, shout out to the Canadian chapter of Climate Reality Book Club for putting this on the map and wanting to do this. Shout out to Island Press for publishing this extraordinary book. But most especially, shout out to you, Beth, because the way your brain works, it's a gift. It's a gift to all of us. And thank you for this book, Multisolving.
Thanks so much, Vernice. And thanks, Ella, for the chance to talk with everybody today.
Thank you both so much. It's been such an honor to hear you talk about this and have you here. So really appreciate this conversation. And to our audience, if you're inspired by what you've heard today and you want to learn how you can take bold climate action, we invite you to join Climate Reality's global network of 3.8 million, working to build a just and sustainable true net zero future. You can visit climaterealityproject.org to read more about our campaigns, programs, and initiatives. And if you're already part of our network, we encourage you to visit Reality Hub to explore our latest action alerts and opportunities for learning. Don't forget to stop by our book club group while you're on there. And if you don't already have an account, you can contact support@climatereality.com and we will assist you. And again, reach out to Ashley or Sherry from the Canada branch to join the next group discussions. They put the info in the chat, and look out for our next book club webinar, which will be in July. Thank you so much for coming.
Good night, all.